Hi there folks, in this video we're gonna get a real close look at the reduce method, and mainly we're gonna go through the material on this MDN page for the reduce method. Very first thing you should notice is that the reduce method is a method of the array prototype. What that means is you can use reduce method on any arrays. Let's start with the simple example. Here's the array to apply the reducer onto, and here's the reducer function. To use this reducer, you just have to pass it as a parameter to the reduce method. This tells the JavaScript to reduce this array using this reducer function. The first version, the effect of that is you just add every single element value in this array, so 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, which is 10. The second one is a little different. It utilizes the same reducer function, but the second parameter is set, which is the initial value. So the effect of this is you add 5 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, so it's for 5 more than the previous one. So it's 15. Not so hard, right? Well, let's continue. Here's an example that doesn't work very well. This max callback reducer function is a bit buggy. It doesn't work. Okay, let me copy it and show you. Okay, we just want this one. Okay, so console log it. So remember, we are using the first callback function, alright? As you can see, not a number. Okay, I have a solution for this though. You just need to first maybe set a initial value of the accumulator to minus infinity. Why? Because it makes sense. You're trying to get maximum value out of these three integer values, 2, 22 and 42. Remember, you're trying to get the maximum, so at the beginning it makes sense to compare it with minus infinity, because every element that are to be compared is at least greater in value than minus infinity, right? Well, let's proceed and make this work. How you make this work? So remember, you set accumulator's value as minus infinity. So you pass in the accumulator, and you're getting the current value out of these objects, right? So that's what current.x is. You obtain these three values, alright? So what do you expect the output would be? It's 42, right? So let's see if it works. 42. So we have fixed the error there. The alternative is just use map method to flatten this object over here. Well, it's an array of objects. Okay, so well, this is what we got, right? Well, let me copy and paste. We are flattening this to be 42, like this. Okay, that's what flattening means. That's done by this map method over here. And then we reduce the flattened array using the second callback. And of course, it would work, right? Here is the same idea of using the minus infinity as the initial value for the accumulator. Let's see if it works. Okay, so copy and paste again. Okay, we don't need these anymore. Okay, so we get another output out of it. Let's console log it. Okay, let's see if it makes sense. You flattened it with the map, and then you reduce it with the second callback function, and set initial value for the accumulator to be minus infinity. So it should work. Yes, 42. It works. Excellent. This is pretty enlightening portion of this document. So I'll go step by step. There are two varieties that you can call reduce method. First one, you omit the initial value for the accumulator, or you can specify the initial value for the accumulator. Let's start with the first version. So you can tell that all it does is it just adds all the values of the array together. So it's 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, which is 10. Okay? As I said, this version has no initial value for the accumulator. Okay? So what it does, the accumulator occupies the first element, and the current value occupies the second element. Okay? So that's what it is. So we got the current index starts from 1 up to 4, so it omits the first one because the first value is occupied by the accumulator, and accumulator is one step behind the return value. Okay, so because there are one less than the length of this array that are computed, you call the reduce operation four times. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so that's what it is. The second one has the initial value set. Well, remember, it's the initial value for the accumulator. It is set to 10, so the current value occupies the first element. So you can see that there are 5 calls to it, In the previous version we only called it 4 times. Now we call it 5 times. Accumulator is set to 10 to begin with. Current value is set to 0. It occupies the first element. So now we have current index starts from 10 up to 4, and we call it 5 times. And as before, the accumulator value is one step behind the return value. Okay, that's what it is. I hope that's clear. There are examples now. Okay, let's do it. This is a very similar example to the first example that we dealt with. It just adds all the values of the array into one value. So it's 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3. And in this case, this is a bit redundant because it's set as 0, but the initial value for the accumulator is set to 0. And sum is 6. Okay, and this is how you write it in an array function. Okay. Okay, this is the one that I covered well previously. So you got this array of objects. Okay. You set the initial value as 0, and then, well, that's the initial value of accumulator is set to 0, and then when it says return and some operation, it means you're updating the value of the accumulator. Okay, so at the very beginning, accumulator is set to 0, and then you add 0 plus 1, and then you return that, and that updates the value of the accumulator for the next iteration. Okay, so I'll do it step by step. Accumulator is set to 0, and 0 plus 1 is 1, and you return that to update the value of accumulator. So now our accumulator is 1, and then you add the updated accumulator value with the next current value, which is 2. So its accumulator value is now is 1, so you add 1 plus 2, so it's 3, and then you update the accumulator values to be 3. Okay, and lastly you add the updated accumulator value with the last current value, which is 3, so it's 3 plus 3, which is 6. So the important thing to realize is inside the reducer function, when it returns something, it always means just one thing. It means that you are updating the value of the accumulator for the next iteration. Okay, so it's easy to think of it as you are just updating accumulator. Okay, and this is how you write it in arrow function. Now we flatten an array. Okay, so here the accumulator's initial value is set to be an empty array. Here's the important thing to realize. Using the reduce method, you can create anything. You can create a value, or you can create an empty. You can create a value like integers or strings or whatever. You can also create arrays, and as you will see later, you can also create objects. In contrast to that, the map method can only return an array. So reduce method is more versatile in that respect. Let's continue. As you can see, the accumulator initial value is set to empty array, and then onto that empty array we concatenate the first nested array. And this concatenate just means you will flatten this array and add it to the empty array. So after first iteration, this value will be just array with two elements, 0 and 1. The same way, after the first iteration, you update the value of the accumulator, which will be just this, right? And then you add this into, you concatenate this array with this, and then you update the accumulator, and then you concatenate the updated accumulator with the last one. So I'll make it more easier to understand. So in the first iteration, you got empty array plus concat 0 1, right? Which is, as I said, it just flattens it, right? Array with two values, right? And then you update the accumulator to be this value, right? The second iteration, you got the updated accumulator to be this, right? So you just concat this with this, which is array with now with 4 elements, right? And then you update accumulator. Then lastly, the third iteration, you got the updated accumulator to be the array with 4 values now, and you concatenate it with the last one, alright, which is array with 6 values now, the same as this. So in effect, you flatten the arrays, right? So it's very important to understand what the return here means. As I said before, it just means you're updating the accumulator value for the next iteration, okay? That's how you do it with the arrow function. Okay. Here you got names, and you call reduce on that names with the reducer function here. Okay, but you first set the initial value of all names, which is the accumulator, as empty object. As you can see, we are populating an object here at the end. Okay, what is name over here in the first iteration? It's the current value, alright, which is the Alice in this case. Okay, so is Alice inside all names? No, because it starts with this empty object, right? If Alice is not inside, which is the case, then you create a property name called Alice, and you assign a numerical value to it. Okay. So what does this mean over here? It just means if the name is already in in the object as the key, then you increment its value. If it's new, you just set it to 1. So in this case, you'd see Alice is mentioned twice, so its value is 2. All others are set to 1. Okay. Okay. Next example. Here, it's easy to get confused by this because it's a little complex. So you have to focus the attention to the output, the final output. The final output is an object with its key set to the value of either the name or the age property. In this case, you're passing the people as expected, but you're looking for the property name age. So as you can see, the final output key corresponds to the value of age, and you group each object by the value of age. Okay, so the second object and third object are grouped together because they all have the age value 20, and the rest is just age value of 21, which is just Alice. Okay, so you won't get confused that way. Okay, so you got this group by method, group by function, which you use it here. Let's focus. We just pass people of the object array and age as property. Okay, so we're returning an object as signified by this here, which is set as the initial value of accumulator. So we are returning an object, so we know it by its initial value. Okay, so what is the key over here? The key is the values, either Alice or 21. In this case, the key is the value of age. Okay, so 21, 20, whatever. And what does this say? If these keys, 20 or 21, are not there, then initialize it with empty array, as you can see here. And it says order the whole thing in terms of age. That's what it means over here. So if that's equal to 20, then you push onto here, we push onto this, the current object. Okay, and then you update the accumulator so you can do the next iteration. Okay, so that's what it is. Okay, this one is less complex and quite enlightening, if you ask me, because, well, you'll see. You got friends, same thing as the way here, but this time they have name, books, and age. Okay, and you call reduce on the friends. Well, at first you set the value of accumulator to be an array with one value, one element, called the alphabet. Okay, so in the first iteration, this is a spread operator. It extracts the value of the initial array. So here you will be alphabet, and then you extract the value of the books for the first object, which is this one, Anna. Okay, so what you'll end up with is alphabet and Bible and Harry Potter, and then you return that array What did I say about returning things inside the reduce method? It updates the value of accumulator. So after the first iteration, accumulator has a value of an array with 3 elements: alphabet, Bible, and Harry Potter. And then on the next iteration, you move on to the second object. You extract the updated accumulator value from previous iteration, and then you just extract books from the second object, extra 2 books. So after the second iteration, you will have alphabet, Bible, Harry Potter, War and Peace, and Romeo and Juliet. And then you return it, which means you update the value of accumulator once again. And lastly, you got the previously updated accumulator plus 2 more books, the Lord of the Rings and the Shining. As you can see here, you can see it in order. Very first one is alphabet, then Bible, Harry Potter, War and Peace, Romeo and Juliet, the Lord of the Rings, and then the Shining, as you can see here. Okay. So the important thing to notice is, I stress it again, you need to understand this when a reducer function returns something. What does it mean? It always means the same thing. It updates the value of the accumulator for the next iteration. I hope you get that. Now, a simple example. You can use maybe filter to do the same. I'm not sure, but anyway, we're using reduce. Well, we're using reduce now. So you got my array of characters, and you call reduce on it, and this is pretty simple. Okay, you set the accumulator initial value to be an empty array, and you search for the current value, and if that current value character is not inside the accumulator, you push it onto the accumulator array. Okay, and then you update the value of accumulator for the next iteration. So you go to the next character and the next character, and each iteration, same logic. If the same okay, so if the previous character value matches the current value, do nothing. Otherwise, add it to the accumulator. So in effect, in the end, you only end up with character values that are not duplicates. Okay. Here we are trying to replace filter map combination with just reduce. Let's have a look. We got numbers that have negative values and positive values, and you got this. We're trying to extract a new array that contains only the positive numbers, but you also double it. Okay, so the logic is inside here. Well, we first set the initial value of the accumulator to an empty array. This is very important. The initial array should reflect the type of the final outcome. Here you're trying to get a new array that matches certain conditions. So it's very important that you set the initial value of the accumulator to an empty array in this case, as with others. So the logic is over here, not too difficult. If it's positive, you double it and then add it or push it to the accumulator. Okay, so the first one will be rejected. 6 and 2 will be included. Because it's greater than 0, the last one will be omitted. So you end up with 12 and 4. Okay, this is a very cool example. you have to know how promise works. I advise you to go through a MDN document on the promise as well, but I'll try to explain as best as I can without going into too much detail about the promise itself. Okay. You got this enclosing run promise sequence, which has an array of promise functions. Okay, and input is the initial resolve value that that starts the promise chain. Okay, so this enclosing function run promise in sequence is an action. What it does, it goes through the array of promise functions and execute them in sequence. Okay, so that's why you're doing this part over here. So you got the reduce function here and the initial value for the accumulator, which is the promise chain. So at first you resolve the input, okay, and then you update the promise chain to that resolved input, and that on that resolved input you use then to execute the next promise function until you've gone through the every function in the array. Okay, you need to understand that each component in the promise chain returns either resolved value or the reason for the failure. In this case, we haven't specified any failure reasons or anything like that, but what you need to understand is at first you resolve the promise at the start of the promise chain, and that input value is the resolved value, which will be passed on to the next promise function using the then handler. Okay, so you would do something like here. Here input value is 10. What does it mean? You resolve the start of the chain with value 10, which will be passed on to P1, where A is 10, so 10 times 5, right, which is 50, and then A becomes 50 is passed on to the next function, so 50 is here times 2, 100, something like that. Okay, so I'll demonstrate it here. This is what happens. Okay, 10 because you at the start you resolved it, so this 10 value gets passed on to as the argument of the next promise function. Here you 10 times 5, and then times 2, then times 3, then times 4, and the final output is value 1200. Okay, very cool. Oh, very cool example. We got 2 examples left. Okay, so we define some logic over here. Don't get confused by this. I would say this means here's a function that takes as argument all the some kind of a array of functions as input, sorry, as argument, and then returns the return output of, sorry, return value of this sub function or something of that kind. Okay, so this whole thing contains this sub function. Okay, so It looks complicated, but it's not okay. So what it does is inside of this function you have access to all the functions on here, okay, the passed at the beginning, okay, and the subfunction has an input as a parameter, and it reduces the functions that are passed from here with the reducer function of this and initial value of input, which is here. Okay, so what does this mean? First of all, you set the value of the accumulator to input, and then you run it with the current function. Okay, and then you update the accumulator to the value return value of this, and in the next iteration you run the next function with the return value of the previous function. So it's something like this. Okay, so you got, if you have array of function 1, function 2, function 3, okay, then what happens is in the first iteration, accumulator is just input, right? Then what happens is in the sorry, not in the first iteration, input is the initial value. Okay, so in the first iteration you do this. Okay, the second iteration you do something like this, and on the third iteration like this. Okay, let's move forward. So we first pass in the array of functions like double, treble, triple, 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 quadruple, quadruple, double, triple, quadruple. These are the functions that are passed over here, and then you pass on the input next, like 6 next, 9, 16, 10. Let's look at the first one. So it has double and triple as its functions, array of function. Okay, so what happened? It's you start with the input value of 6, right, and then you doubled it. Okay, and then you tripled it. Okay, so what is it? What is that? 12 times 3 is 36. Okay, and same as the other ones. Okay, let me give you more example. Yes, so what about the second one? The input value is 9. Okay, and then you got two functions that are registered, triple and triple. So you just times the input by 3, and then you times again its return value by 3, so you end up with 81, and so on. So it's very cool. Lastly, we try to use reduce to do the same thing as map. What did I say about map previously? Well, map is a method to transform an array into another array, but I told you that reduce can do anything to an array. Okay, you can convert an array to a value, to another array, or even object. So you can do this. Okay, so you got the outer function called map using reduce with two arguments, callback and this, but we don't use this to be honest, so just ignore that. We call in callback, and you can see, first of all, because this is set up on the array prototype, you can use map using reduce to any arrays. That's what is happening here. We're applying the method, or the function, okay, the method to this array, for example, and you can see that this is the callback that is passed. Okay, and then we're trying to reduce this array into a new array. So you set the initial value of the accumulator to be an empty array. In this case, initial value of mapped array. Okay, and what does this mean? It means, remember, callback is, stop over here, you're calling this code inside of map using reduce and pass these three, which come from within, onto here. Okay, so the current value, index, and array length, they all come from here. Okay, so you passed in whatever the current value, index, and array that your reducer function gives you. You pass it on to this code and execute it, and whatever the return value, you map it onto the current index. Okay, at the end you end up with this, right? Let me explain. So you got like this. You're transforming into another array using the logic specified here. Okay, so the first one, current value is 1, index is 0, array length is 4, so you end up with 5. Second one, current value is 2, index is 1, array length is 4, 7. Third one has no value. The last one, current value is 3, index is 3, array length is 4, so it's 10. Okay, remember it said you are trying to implement map-like operation using reduce. What I've done here is I can do all this using just map, which is simpler. Okay, let's just run it. Yep, it gives you the same output. Okay, so in this case, using map is a simpler option. I hope all that makes sense. I'll finish with how reduce works. I'll go over it one last time. Okay. Okay. There are a few points that you must understand out of this. Okay. In the first example, it has no initial value to be set on accumulator, so the current value starts with index 0. Oh, sorry, I'll say it again. In this example, the initial value of accumulator is not set. Okay, so the accumulator occupies the first element and current value occupies the second. Okay, so we have 4 iterations to be done, and the current index in the first iteration is 1 with value of 1, because the accumulator has no initial value set, so it occupies the first index. Okay. Next, you need to understand what returning means inside the reducer function. It always means you are updating the value of the accumulator with whatever you return here. Okay. So in the first iteration, accumulator is set to the value of the first index, which is 0. Okay. In the second iteration, you get provided with the value 0 plus 1, so the accumulator becomes 1, and so on. Okay. So here the first iteration is set to the initial value. Second iteration, it gets updated to 1 because it's 0 plus 1. And the third call, it's 1 plus 2, so it's 3. And then it's just fourth one, it's 3 plus 3, so it's 6. Okay. Lastly, in this example, we have set the initial value of the accumulator to be 10. Because it doesn't need to occupy space, current value is set, well, I mean, in terms of accumulator, so current value is set to the first index. So we need to call it 5 times now. Okay. In the same way, the return statement means we are updating the value of the accumulator. Okay. So at the beginning, its accumulator is 10, and then you add it to 0, which is 10. Then you update it. Then you add 1 to it, then 11. Add 2 to it, 13, and add 3 to it, 16. So as you can see, at the end of each iteration, it returns a value that updates the accumulator with that new value. Okay. Thank you for watching. See you next time.